one wrong move, and he would fall and get destroyed by everyone. Jonathan was a simple prince of Israel. He was also the son of King Saul. He became friends with the boy who defeated the giant Goliath, David. At the time, Jonathan was promised to be the king of Israel. But because of Saul's jealousy toward David, Jonathan was forced to choose between his father and his closest friend, and that choice would eventually cost him everything, including his life. Jonathan was the son of Saul, the first king of Israel. He was a brave young man, skilled with a bow, fast on his feet, and a fierce fighter in battle. He loved his father deeply, but his heart was always set on doing what was right, even when it cost him everything. In those days, the Philistines were a powerful and merciless enemy, pressing down on Israel from every side. They were warriors who had fought in countless wars, hardened men with armor of bronze and spears tipped with iron. They had set up a garrison at Gilboa, a stronghold watching over the land, taunting the people of Israel who lived in its shadow. Most of Israel had no swords or spears at all, because the Philistines had taken away every blacksmith from the land, leaving the people with nothing but plows and sickles to defend their homes. A nation without weapons stood against a nation built entirely for war. Jonathan gathered 1,000 men and struck down the Philistine garrison at Gilboa, tearing apart what the enemy thought was untouchable. When the Philistines heard what he had done, their fury shook the land. They gathered their armies together at Michmash, and the sight of them was enough to make grown men collapse to their knees. Their numbers were like the sand along the seashore, stretching across the hills as far as the eye could see, with chariots of iron and horsemen riding ahead of foot soldiers whose spears caught the sunlight like a field of fire. The men of Israel saw them coming and were seized with terror. Many ran and hid themselves in caves, in cracks among the rocks, in pits and thickets, anywhere the darkness could swallow them. Saul stayed behind with the few men who had not yet fled, but their hearts pounded with dread, because they had no army that could stand against what was coming down from the hills. But what they did not know was that very soon, one quiet act of courage, carried out by only 2 men, would shatter the enemy's spirit completely and turn their terror into chaos. Before going into battle, it was the custom in Israel to offer a burnt sacrifice to the Lord, asking for his blessing and protection before the fighting began. An animal would be killed and burned whole upon an altar, and only a prophet or priest was permitted to carry out this offering, never the king himself. Saul waited at Gilgal for the prophet Samuel to arrive and perform this sacrifice, so the army could march into battle with the Lord's favor resting upon them. But Samuel didn't come at the time he had promised. Day after day passed beneath a heavy, anxious sky, and Saul's men, watching the Philistines grow thicker across the hills like a storm cloud rolling closer, began to lose heart entirely, one by one. Then in greater numbers, they slipped away from the camp under cover of darkness, until almost no one remained standing beside their king. On the 7th day, with Samuel still nowhere in sight, and his army reduced to a mere handful of trembling men, Saul could wait no longer. He took the animal that had been set aside for the offering and performed the sacrifice with his own hands, even though this was strictly forbidden for a king to do. The moment the flames rose from the altar, Samuel arrived. He asked Saul why he had done such a thing, and Saul answered that he feared his last soldiers would scatter and the Philistines would crush them before the Lord's favor had even been sought. Samuel's words fell heavy upon him. He told Saul that because of this disobedience, his kingdom would not endure, and that the Lord had already chosen another man to take his place as king over Israel. Saul did not yet know the name of that man, but the words could not be called back, and from that day on, An invisible crack ran through his throne. The Philistines spread out across the countryside like locusts, sending raiding parties in 3 directions to plunder, burn, and terrify, while Israel had almost nothing left in their hands to fight back with. Only Saul and Jonathan carried true weapons of war. One of the most interesting parts of Jonathan's life was the day he decided to act completely alone, without permission, without an army, without even telling his own father. He turned to his armor-bearer and said, "Come, let us cross over to the garrison of the Philistines on the other side." The young man did not hesitate. The 2 of them walked out toward a narrow, brutal pass cut between 2 jagged cliffs. Jonathan told his armor-bearer that if the Philistines looked down and shouted for them to wait where they stood, they would stay below. But if the Philistines called out, "Come up to us," they would climb, because that would be the sign that the Lord himself had handed the enemy over into their hands. They stepped out into the open, where the Philistine watchmen could see them clearly. The enemy soldiers looked down at the 2 lone figures and burst into mocking laughter, shouting, "Look! The Hebrews are crawling out of their holes!" Then, full of arrogance, certain the 2 men posed no threat at all, they called down, "Come up to us, and we will teach you a lesson you won't forget." The moment Jonathan heard those words, he began climbing, digging his hands and feet into the cracks of the rock face, his armor-bearer scrambling right behind him. When he reached the top, breathless and covered in dust, he struck down the first soldiers standing there before they even understood what was happening. Then something extraordinary swept through the entire Philistine camp.
Before we continue, these videos takes many hours. If you could please like and subscribe and comment which country you are watching this from.
A trembling, unnatural panic, sent by the hand of God himself, tore through their ranks like wildfire. Men who had stood like an unstoppable wall of iron, before everyone suddenly turned on each other in blind confusion, swords clashing against their own brothers in the smoke and noise, as told in 1 Samuel 14. Saul, sitting beneath a pomegranate tree in Gilboa, looked out and saw the enemy camp dissolving into chaos in the distance. He counted the soldiers around him and realized his son Jonathan was missing. He did not yet understand what had happened on that ridge, but he knew deep in his chest that something massive had just been set into motion. The Israelites, who had been hiding for days in the hills and forests of Mount Ephraim, heard the cries of the fleeing Philistines, and they poured out of their hiding places to join the chase. Even the Hebrews, who had been forced to serve inside the Philistine camp, turned their weapons on their former masters. And the Lord saved Israel that day in a way no one could have predicted that morning. But in the middle of the chase, Saul made a reckless vow before all his men, swearing a curse on anyone who stopped to eat until the enemy was completely wiped out. The soldiers, already weak with hunger from days of fear and fasting, pressed on through a forest where wild honey dripped thick from the branches onto the ground. Jonathan, who had not heard his father's vow, dipped the end of his staff into the honeycomb and ate, feeling strength return to his tired body almost instantly. When a soldier told him of the oath Saul had sworn, Jonathan said plainly that the army would have fought far better that day with food in their stomachs instead of empty, aching bellies. By evening, the men were so overcome with hunger that they slaughtered animals right there on the open ground and devoured the meat with the blood still in it, breaking the law of the Lord without even realizing the weight of what they had done. Saul built an altar to set things right, then asked the priest to inquire of the Lord whether he should press the attack through the night and finish off the scattered enemy completely. But no answer came from heaven, only silence. Saul declared before his men that someone among them had sinned. and that whoever it was would die for it, even if it turned out to be his own son. He cast lots before the entire army, and the lot fell directly on Jonathan. Saul turned to his son, his face pale, and demanded to know what he had done. Jonathan answered without flinching, telling him plainly about the honey at the end of his staff, and said he was ready to die for it, if that was what justice required. But the soldiers would not allow it. They rose up together and declared that Jonathan had worked alongside God himself to win such an impossible victory that day, and that not a single hair on his head should be touched. So the people stood between Jonathan and his own father's blade, and Jonathan was spared from death. Sometime later, a shepherd boy named David arrived at the camp, carrying nothing more than a sling and 5 smooth stones gathered from a riverbed. The Philistines had returned again, and this time they brought with them a champion named Goliath, a giant of a man covered head to toe in bronze armor, his spear alone weighing more than most men could lift. A figure so massive and terrifying that he had mocked the armies of Israel for 40 straight days, without a single soldier daring to face him. David stepped out into the open field and struck him down with one stone hurled straight into his forehead, and the giant who had terrified an entire nation fell dead in the dirt. The Philistines, watching their champion crumble, turned and fled in terror, and Israel chased them down without mercy. When David was brought before Saul afterward, Jonathan stood watching, and something happened between the two of them that would shape the rest of both their lives. Jonathan's heart became bound to David's, as if they had been brothers since birth, and he loved him as much as he loved his own life. He took off his own royal robe and placed it on David, then gave him his sword, his bow, and his belt. And the two of them made a solemn covenant of loyalty before the Lord that neither one would ever break. But Saul's heart began to twist with a darkness that grew heavier by the day. He watched the women of Israel sing songs praising David's name above his own, and a consuming jealousy took root deep inside him. He began plotting against David in secret, sending him into the most dangerous battles he could find, hoping he would never return, and even hurling his spear at him with his own hands inside the walls of his own house. David fled the palace under cover of night, and Saul's rage only grew darker and more dangerous with each passing day. One of the hardest moments of Jonathan's life came when he was forced to choose between the father who raised him and the friend he loved as his own soul. Saul called David back, swearing on his life that he meant him no harm, but David refused to trust the words of a man who had already tried to kill him twice. He went to Jonathan in a quiet field and begged him to find out the truth hidden behind his father's promises. Jonathan agreed, and together they devised a plan. David would hide himself in the field for 3 days, while Jonathan tested his father's heart at the dinner table, sending word back through a secret signal made with arrows. At the feast, Saul noticed David's seat sitting empty. Jonathan offered an excuse for his absence, and Saul's face twisted into a rage so violent it shook the entire room. He turned on his own son, calling him a disgrace to his own house, accusing him of betraying his father's throne for the sake of a shepherd boy. He told Jonathan that as long as David drew breath, neither of them would ever sit safely upon the throne of Israel. Jonathan asked what crime David had even committed to deserve such hatred, and in a blind fury, Saul seized his spear and hurled it at his own son, the same way he once had hurled it at David. Jonathan rose from the table without a word and walked out into the night, burning with grief for the friend he was about to lose. The next morning, Jonathan walked out to the field carrying his bow, with a young boy beside him to retrieve the arrows. He drew back the bow and shot an arrow far beyond where the boy stood, then called out the secret words, "The arrow is beyond you." The hidden signal that told David his life was in danger and he must flee immediately. He sent the boy back into the city carrying the weapons, and once they were finally alone, Jonathan went to David, hiding among the rocks. The two men wept together in the open field, knowing exactly what this parting meant for both of their lives. Jonathan reminded David of the oath sworn between them long ago, that their families would remain bound together no matter what storm came between them. And then David rose to his feet and disappeared into the wilderness. David spent the long months that followed running from place to place, hiding in remote caves and rugged desert strongholds, while Saul hunted him relentlessly across the land with an army at his back. In the wilderness of Ziph, surrounded by jagged rock and scorching heat, Jonathan found him one final time. He strengthened David's hand in God, telling him once more that he would one day sit upon the throne of Israel, and that he, Jonathan, would stand faithfully beside him when that day finally came. The two of them renewed their covenant before the Lord. And then Jonathan returned home to his father's house, while David remained behind in hiding, as written in 1 Samuel 23. The years rolled forward, and the long war between Israel and the Philistines never truly ended. The Philistines gathered once more, an enormous and terrifying force, camping near Mount Gilboa and spreading their armies across the valley of Jezreel like a dark flood. Saul gathered what remained of Israel's army and camped on the slopes above them. The night before the battle, fear gripped Saul so completely that he sought out a medium for guidance, since the prophet Samuel had long since died, and the Lord had stopped answering him through dreams or priests. The spirit of Samuel rose before him and spoke without mercy, telling him plainly that Israel would fall the very next day, and that Saul and his sons would die alongside their men. At dawn, the Philistines surged forward against Israel's weakened lines, and the men of Israel began to break and scatter beneath the weight of the assault. Jonathan fought fiercely alongside his father and his brothers on the slopes of Gilboa. But the Philistine archers pressed in close, raining down arrows without pause. And Jonathan was struck down on that mountain, falling alongside his brothers Abinadab and Malchishua. Saul himself was wounded badly by the arrows, and rather than be captured alive and dragged in chains before his enemies, he fell upon his own sword. Seeing the king dead on the ground, his armor-bearer did the very same. The Philistines returned the next day to strip the bodies of the fallen, and there, among the dead on Mount Gilboa, they found Saul and his 3 sons lying together. They cut off Saul's head and hung the bodies of the king and his sons upon the wall of Beth-shan for all to see. When the men of Jabesh-Gilead heard what had been done, they marched through the night without rest, took the bodies down from the wall, carried them home, and buried their bones beneath a tree, mourning for 7 long days. Far away, David received word of the battle from a messenger who had fled the slaughter at Gilboa. When he heard that Saul and Jonathan had both fallen on that mountain, he tore his clothes and wept bitterly. And every man standing with him did the same. David composed a lament for the 2 of them, and commanded that it be taught throughout all of Israel. And in it he spoke of his friend, calling him dearly loved, swifter than eagles, stronger than lions, grieving that he had fallen in the very midst of the battle.
These videos takes many hours. If you could please like and subscribe and comment which country you are watching this from.